The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Martin Barrett, Senior Sales Engineer at Cybereason. And today I'm going to take you through a session basically demonstrating an advanced attack, some of the tools and techniques used, and then ways that we at Cybereason can potentially detect and stop those hacks at every step of the way. I just wanted to start today's session with a bit of etiquette for today. So during the session, if you have any questions around what you're seeing, or if it prompts any questions around your own environment, please feel free to actually type in the questions within the GoToWebinar control panel. And then during the session, I'll keep checking to see if there's any questions that have popped up and look to answer those during the session. But I'll particularly focus at the end of the session where, it's where we can have some more time to go through that. Okay, so let's begin with pretty much a history lesson. Let's look up ago at an example of a true nation state level attack. So an attack on the Democratic National Congress a couple of years ago. If you think of the context, it was before the actual election in the US. It was just after the DNC had chosen Hillary Clinton as their candidate for the upcoming elections for the US, the United States of America. And these leaks into DC leaks and WikiLeaks effectively really could potentially change the course of history. So from a context point of view, Hillary had just defeated Bernie Sanders as being the candidate for the Democratic Party. But these leaks actually showed that the Democratic Party had, in particular, sided with Hillary Clinton. She was almost seen as the chosen candidate for the election, and Bernie Sanders had been sidelined. Also, there was evidence of the media being very kind to Hillary Clinton by giving the questions that they were going to ask her in broadcast beforehand, so she was prepared. So this really gave a real slant against, or a negative slant against, Hillary Clinton coming up to the US elections. And this has been since attributed to a couple of nation state groups out of Russia. So APT-29, otherwise known as Cozy Bear, and APT-28, otherwise known as Fancy Bear. Okay, so I just wanted to use this as an example of some of the things that, even 2 years ago, 2 years is a long time in hacking, and obviously a long time in politics as well. But this is a good example of some of the nation state tools and techniques that were being used then, but we're really seeing them start to trickle down into kind of the criminal elements out there, but then ultimately script kiddies will potentially start using these tool sets as well. So let's have a deeper dive into what those are. So one of the first methods used was phishing. So it was used to get into the DNC, so the likes of John Podesta, etc., send him an email with a link, with a malicious link, and use that as the staging post to get into the environment. It still works. People still click on those links. So whether it's in an email with an attachment, or whether it's with a link, or via social media, etc., this is a good way that hackers still use, no matter what controls you have on the perimeter, to actually get into an environment as the staging post for the attack, for maybe the first step of command and control, etc. Other things, so fileless malware, a really big part of the hacker's toolkit now. So nation state into criminal elements. And you may have heard of another term for fileless malware of living on the land. So effectively, fileless malware is using tools that are part of natively within the operating system. So the likes of PSExec, PowerShell, etc. PowerShell being the real attack vector for hackers. And by the nature of the name, it evades traditional AV because there's no file to capture. It also evades sandboxing technology because there's no file to look into to see what are the steps after the detonation of that file to see what happens. If there's no file, you can't do that with the sandbox. So this is increasingly being used by hackers to not only get into the environment, but steps afterwards as well. If you can actually do an attack without needing to actually introduce code on the endpoint, that you're much lower under the radar. If we look at traditional ways of trying to block attacks. And then finally, what we're seeing in the wild a lot, it wasn't part of the DNC hack, but we're seeing the utilization more and more in different ways, is ransomware. So what we call ransomware version 1 was, being very noisy in an environment and asking for, as the name suggests, a ransom of Bitcoin, etc. For XP-based machines, if we look at the NHS in the UK, for example. But we've seen new iterations of ransomware, so the likes of NotPetya and Bad Rabbit, where this is actually used as what's called a wiper. So this, if you think, ransomware can be used as the last stage of a hack to cover your tracks as a hacker, because the behavior of ransomware essentially is trying to encrypt lots of data very, very quickly. So what that can be used is to cover the tracks. After a successful hack, forensically, a hacker can be very, very noisy in the environment, detonate ransomware on multiple machines to divert the analyst elsewhere. But the actual damage stage, i.e. encrypting information, might encrypt the Windows logs, might encrypt, login details, etc. Or, the stuff that the hacker might have left behind and be used by the analyst or the IR consultant to actually piece the puzzle back together to find out who actually was in the environment. So these are a few of the tools and techniques that, yes, the first two were part of the DNC, that nation state attack, but we're really seeing that trickle down effect and that then being commonly used, yes, for targeted attacks, but for much more sustained attacks, or like the kind of criminal kind of elements getting into environments. So for the, let's get into how the traditional spend in the IT environment has been, in the IT security environment in particular. So it's been very, very much perimeter based. Concentrate that effort of keeping the bad guy out. So there's been iterations of firewalling into next-gen firewalling, intrusion prevention to, again, stop the bad guy. Sandboxing, so what happens when a file detonates? Let's test that out before a user can actually download it. And then traditional antivirus and even NGAV. There's been that concentration of spend, so 80% of spend on building that bigger wall. But then on the other hand, there's a big gap. So the other 20% of spend has been, okay, after the damage has been done, after the hack has been successful, let's look at the SIM logs. We've been capturing maybe information from the network, from the domain controllers, from particular places where information is stored. Also the expenditure on incident response, like the boots on the ground to actually work backwards on what happened. But we think there's a huge gap in between. So between the perimeter being breached and then the damage being done, there's lots of stages, or what we call the non-negotiables, that a hacker is doing in between to actually get to data exfiltration, etc., that we think we can capture. So if we think the initial infection, i.e. of the first stage after the perimeter breach, that normally is combined with the next step of a hacker of maybe like reconnaissance and the command and control, i.e. the remote access for the hacker into the environment. But normally, the machine that the hacker lands on is normally a low-level user, because generally a hacker is targeting somebody who is more likely to click on a link, okay, and get that initial infection, the command and control of that machine. But they're probably not interested in the information that that user has on their machine. So they will have to go through a few non-negotiable steps to ultimately get to, say, the CEO's machine, or get to the server that holds the unique IP, or the application server, which is hosting the mission critical application. So there's other steps like lateral movement between machines, privileged escalation, so the move from being a normal user to maybe local admin, etc., before the damage stage is reached. And hence why we see that various analyst reports say that this is between, say, 99 days and some others say 200 days. So there's a big gap between the initial infection and then the actual damage stage. And that gives us, as an organization within Cybereason, a lot of information to potentially capture those steps that the hacker is doing in between. So let's look into the actual demonstration itself today. So for the demonstration, I've simulated a company with a couple of named users. So there's Robert, who's the executive assistant. So in this case, the hacker is going to target Robert because as a semi-low level user, he's probably got a busy inbox, etc., managing multiple executives. So not only the CEO, but maybe the CFO, for example. So busy looking through calendars, etc., more likely to click on a malicious link. But ultimately, the hacker is trying to get into the organization and get to Maria, the CEO's machine, to actually extract data from that machine. So there'll be a few steps. So the non-negotiables I was talking about, I'm basically going to boil down the 99 days that we had in the previous slide to a hack of about 20 minutes. So a lot of this will be narrowed down, but a lot of the tools and techniques that would have been used in the D&T hack, I'll be using some of those for the demonstration. So let's pivot from the presentation to my demo environment. Okay, so a few machines here. Yeah. So the hacker is in effect using Metasploit. So you may have heard of Metasploit before. It's quite heavily used in red teaming exercises for penetration tests, etc. But this is increasingly being used by criminal elements, script kiddies, to actually use hacking tools and techniques via this command line here. In this example, I'm using the underlying operating system is Kali in effect. So again, it's like a red team tool, but used heavily by hackers now. Then on the other side, I have the nicely named victim 3.1, which is Robert's machine. And then victim 3.2, which is the CEO's machine in the same environment. So to set the scene, the hacker has sent out malicious emails or spear phishing emails into the environment. So the way that a hacker would normally think is, I'm going to send out a few emails to users within that environment. I'm going to do my research on LinkedIn, find out the hierarchy of the business, etc. And Robert was one of those guys that came up. Okay. So if we pivot over to Robert's machine, we'll see here that and it's a fairly rudimentary example, but a good way of demonstrating the first stage of an attack. So Robert's clicked on the link, opened up Excel, and there's in effect some active content within this email. But again, this is an example site. It could have been via social media, you name it. There's lots of ways of getting into the environment. So as users do, let's pivot back to the hacker's machine. So the hacker in effect now is just, he's set out the hooks with the bait across multiple users. So the hacker's in effect just waiting for somebody to bite, waiting for somebody to click on that link and then check the context of that user to think about what the next step will be of the hack. Because again, if the hacker's done his homework, he would have researched on LinkedIn, maybe called the HR department, etc., to find maybe where they're physically located in the building, thinking about the next step of the hack. Okay, so as the hacker, I've seen now that somebody's clicked on the link. Okay, so my first step is to get a bit of context. So interacting with this session, I want to see exactly who. So I know that he's the executive assistant, etc. But as a hacker, this would be the place where I'd be most concerned in the hack. This is the noisiest part of the attack because as we'll get into in a little while, effectively the payload on that email was PowerShell based. So in effect, there's a PowerShell session that's going from Robert's endpoint, basically doing a command and control to my session here effectively on the internet. So this could potentially ring alarm bells, like if you have a next generation firewall, etc., or something on the proxy that sees actually there's PowerShell traffic going out of your environment. That's kind of strange. So maybe a switched on analyst looking at that might start to think, okay, I need to get onto that endpoint to see what's happening. Okay, so I, as a hacker, I want to pivot pretty quickly. Okay, what are the running, what will look, unsuspicious connecting to the internet? So an obvious candidate here is a browser, so Firefox. So I'm going to pivot, or what we call process, I'm going to do process injection to hide behind that valid process. Migrate behind what's known as the parent ID here. And this does get to Robert's machine, and it's did a rudimentary check on, say, Task Manager, he wouldn't see a PowerShell program, he would just see a Firefox process, because that process has been injected, so the hacker thinks he's covered his tracks here. Okay, so the noisy bit, or the noisiest bit of the attack is now under the radar. Next, I want to do a bit of reconnaissance to see what's nearby. Using a process called NetView. So this has been part of Windows for, I remember my first job at a university, like the year 2000, that was part of Windows then. It's a valid tool used all the time by admins to say do network troubleshooting, etc. So by itself, this doesn't look malicious in any way whatsoever. It's very, very normal. And this effect gives you an idea of maybe at the switch level, what machines are nearby, okay? For the purposes of the demo, this is very friendly. So straight away, I can see Maria, the CEO's machine, is nearby. But in real life, the hacker might need to move around the environment quite a few times. So like doing lateral movement, privileged escalation, etc., to get to the ultimate target. But because I'm condensing essentially 99 days into 30 minutes, this is very friendly to the hacker. So he knows that Maria's machine is one step away. So next, I'm just give a bit of context. I'm literally logged into Robert's machine as Robert. So Robert himself is not that privileged on this machine. So the next step I need to do is run some code or run an exploit against the machine to actually get privileged escalation. So from Robert to local system type access, because that gives me more access to the machine itself. So first, I'm going to get some more information around Robert's machine itself, so the architecture. And then at this point, either within Metasploit itself or the little black book that the hacker may have with exploits readily available, or going to the dark web and spending 20 bucks on an exploit against this particular build. But anyway, I'm going to find a way to get onto this machine, whether it's patched to a level or unpatched, whatever it may be, there's going to be a way into this machine at some point. Okay, so let me just background this session and run the exploit against that machine. So what I'm using here is actually, it's a Windows pop-up vulnerability on that version. Into that valid exe to then run the payload against that. So now if I do get UID, from Robert to the system level access. So it's not a logged in user, but it gives me certain rights on that machine. So now I can run tools such as Mimikatz in this case. So Mimikatz gives me the ability to look into running memory and unencrypt things like admin passwords, for example. Again, if the hacker has homework, he might have been password is the same across the estate. So it's very, for ease of use, it's great for admins so they know that the local admin across the estate is the same when somebody calls into the help desk. But from a security point of view, this is definitely a way in for the hacker. So if we see here, if we look at point 5 here, I can see what the local administrator account on Robert's machine is in the clear. And if I know that this organization is using a golden image, the chances are that the CEO's machine is going to have the same password as well. So the next step, I'm going to use another element of fileless malware. So I've been using a few PowerShell-based tools. I'm actually going to use ps-exec next to jump from Robert's machine to the CEO's machine. So ps-exec is used all the time by admins for things like expedited patching, etc. So patching is normally done via GPO, but say if you had a mission critical server where you wanted to patch it straight away, you'd use ps-exec to do that. It's been part of Windows for a while, part of sysinternals within Windows. So again, on its own, looks completely non-malicious. Session run. And then effectively, once that's done, it should have it, or we should get another session of command and control from Maria, the CEO's machine, which is a separate session from the ones we previously. So just interact with that. That I've logged into the CEO as administrator. So I now have the keys to the kingdom, in effect. Mission accomplished. I can access anything on that machine. So I could pull out PST files, I could pull out files around mergers and acquisitions, things that are very, very sensitive to the company. Maybe I want to get personal information around the CEO. But in fact, I have the keys to the kingdom. I can do whatever I want on that machine now. So I'm at the data exfiltration stage. I can pull a lot of information back from that machine. But the next step, after extracting that information, is I want to get noisy in the environment. So as I suggested in the second slide, I'm going to use ransomware to actually get noisy and then actually cover my tracks. I'm going to try and encrypt the information on the endpoint after I've done the damage. So I'm actually going to use a PowerShell-based mass encryption tool to actually cover my track. Probably do that on a lot of machines to get noisy, to get the analysts running around screaming, dealing with, fighting that fire immediately. And, they're potentially thinking that there's a version 1 ransomware outbreak and thinking that the pain has stopped, where in fact, I'm potentially posting up the CEO's information, onto GitHub, onto wherever it may be, doing a big data dump. Okay, so let me just pivot back to the slides, just to illustrate what we saw. Okay, so a few of the steps that we saw. So the initial phishing email, which is effectively an Excel file with a macro and a PowerShell payload. Then we had the code injection to hide behind Firefox. Then we had the use of system-based tools to do some reconnaissance. Then the use of the exploit, the use of ps-exec to laterally move. And well, the step before that was the use of Mimikatz for credential theft, and then the detonation of ransomware at the end. Okay, so how would potentially an existing SOC have dealt with that. The problem is that the noise it's just the alert noise from tools is just too big. We've seen this in a lot of recent attacks where, you know, maybe the sandbox technology might have picked up on some of this information, or maybe the next generation firewall would have picked up and say PowerShell spawning out to the internet. But there's no context across the entire attack. The analyst has to spend a lot of time researching this information where there's a lot of false positives around this. So spending a lot of time researching potential false positives and finding out that they're at a dead end. And they need to treat each alert with equal value. And that's really time consuming. That's really, it's really hard on the analyst where they have to spend so much time and getting to that dead end and you know, using the same enthusiasm for every alert, knowing, you know, full well that they need to research further by looking at firewall logs maybe to get a bit of context, or looking at DNS logs to really put the picture together. It's really, really time consuming. And the nature of attacks now, the hacker's already moved on and covered his tracks. So it's a really, really hard job for the analyst to keep up with traditional tools. Which is before, and unfortunately I've had to quite a lot in the past, having to write a lot of SQL, etc. Everything is one relationship deep, or, you know, one to one or one to many, which is, you know, joining the dots on a cyber attack. That's you just can't do it with a relational database, which is how SIMs are approaching it. There's not enough information that they can compute, or there's not enough numbers that they can crunch to be able to give you a view of what's actually happening in the environment from a cybersecurity point of view in a timely manner. So Cybereason looks at the problem in a different way. We see it as a data problem. So the relational database isn't the way to solve a data problem. We've seen that, like with the failure of SIM tools to do what they were promised to do. So before we actually shipped a product, we actually were in stealth mode for 2 years and built what's known as a graph database from scratch in stealth mode. That's a graph database that's actually running in memory as well, so for additional speed. And our aim was to be able to collect as much information as possible from the endpoints and correlate that across the entire environment. So rather than treating each endpoint individually as a different entity and asking the question, is that endpoint under attack? We're asking the question, is the organization under attack across all of those endpoints in the environment? So some examples of, you know, graph databases being used recently. So you may have heard of the Panama Papers a couple of years ago. So where there was actually a hack on a legal firm in Panama, which had been used as a way of control or hiding high net value assets via shell companies, etc. So this firm in Panama was, you know, basically the Dropbox for different shell companies. So the likes of Russian oligarchs hiding, you know, assets that they own. So maybe a property in London, say a property in Knightsbridge, and it's owned by shell company after shell company after shell company, for example. And the investigators found that the only way that they could derive ultimate ownership of assets back was by putting the data that they found within this Panama legal firm into a graph database, because the relationships between the data points are there out of the box. So in effect, maybe there might have been a PO box that was in common or a phone number that was in common. That relationship came out of the box, and they were able to derive it back directly back to unique ownership. Other examples are Facebook and LinkedIn. So the social graph that they use. How are we connected with other people? So it's, you know, seemingly untangible ways that we're connected. So it might be a phone number in common. It might be somewhere where you checked in common. This is why Facebook says that, oh, your friend checked into this city you've just landed in 2 weeks ago, and this is what they did, because they're putting that information into a graph database. This is why you get emails from LinkedIn and Facebook saying, we suggest that you might be friends with this person. underlying, it might be a case that you might have gone to the same college and then you've moved to the same town since then. So what seems to be intangible links that actually make sense from a social networking point of view. So we're trying to do the same thing from a cybersecurity point of view. So how do we put this into practice? So I've a couple of slides ago, I've got into the problem of analysts being overloaded with information. But we all know that the issue now with analysts is they're a finite resource. They're very much in demand. There's various papers out there talking about shortfalls of IT security and cybersecurity skills, a shortfall of 2 million headcount within the next few years. So they're very much in demand, but so we need to make them much more efficient in their job. No longer do they need to deal with false positives day in, day out. And if they're getting bogged down in that in an organization, they're getting phone calls from cybersecurity recruiters all the time to move elsewhere. And how does an L1 analyst who's bogged down in false positives, how do they skill up to L2, L3 when they're stuck in the weeds all the time? So it can be very frustrating for the analyst. But it's also from an organizational point of view, you need the analyst to be efficient to make informed decisions quickly to stop these advanced attacks that are happening out there. So we see this as a data problem. So if we can gather enough information from, at this moment, it's the endpoint, but we very much have a roadmap to start looking at gathering information from other types of data in the organization and Internet of Things ultimately as well. But in effect, at the bottom of this pyramid here, which is what we call the MALOP pyramid, so the high fidelity alert, we're in effect gathering telemetry information from the endpoint. So things like, what is the process hierarchy? Okay, so what's the process, the parent ID, the child ID, etc., and what's the change of that relationship? What are the inbound and outbound connections, for example? What DNS type information is being looked up for, URLs, etc. What are the logged in users? What are the mount points, etc. Okay, so we're gathering this from all of the endpoints in the environment that have a lightweight sensor installed on, which bear in mind that it doesn't need a reboot. So it's what we call a do no harm sensor. So it's very, very easy to push out very, very quickly. We've had some customers having 100,000 sensors rolled out in the space of a day or two. So it's, we want to flip the idea of a sensor on its head as well. So the first thing that we will do is look for the stuff that's really apparent. So if we take that information, put it into threat feeds that we have within connected to the graph database, there might be something like there's a connection from this endpoint and it's trying to connect to a domain that's known for hosting malware, for example. Okay, that might be an initial indicator for us. Or maybe the endpoint, the signature AV isn't up to date, but we have a live feed in from the likes of VirusTotal. So we've seen that file detonate, but we're picking up some of the behaviors around that, and we can potentially block that next time, or fill the gap between the signature being updated and the 0 day, for example. But effectively what we do is then we push that into the AI hunting engine in the graph, and then we're looking for things that are behaviorally signs of malicious things happening. And then we're kind of building that body of evidence up to get to the top, the high fidelity alert at the top, the MALOP. Whereas if you think with a relational database, a SIM is basically flagging an alert based on very flat data. So if A and B match in a rule, then we're going to trigger an alert. So the context there is very, very low. Whereas the analogy I use is we're approaching this like the police would get to investigating, say, a murder scene. We're looking for not just a murder weapon, we're looking for fingerprints. We're looking for CCTV imagery. We're looking to interview maybe the prime suspects, friends and family, to find out where they were between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Looking at where did they use their credit card? Where did their phone check in? Via triangulation on the cell network. We're looking to gather a lot of pieces of information to get to that malop. So in the same way that the police, they won't go in front of a judge and jury based upon one piece of evidence. They're gathering a body of evidence together to get in front of a judge and jury to have high confidence that they can convict their suspect. We're doing the same thing with the information that we're collecting from the endpoint and making the analysts much more efficient in their decision-making criteria to make that decision quickly and automating a lot of the mundane tasks that an analyst might have had to do in the past. Okay. So at that point, I'll just quickly pivot to see if there's any questions before we get into the Cybereason UI. So a couple of questions here. So what kind of mechanism do you use to intercept the ransomware before it reaches the good files? So yeah, good question. So I'll get into this a bit in the demonstration. So effectively, we use a few things. So the main thing being what's known as canary files on the endpoint. So the real damage stage of ransomware is when the mass encryption of data happens. So these canary files, in the same way that a canary in a coal mine was looking for gas, these files are looking for processes that are trying to do mass encryption of data quickly. So we can actually stop that from running. But we also look at any changes to the master boot record and any things around shadow copy deletion, etc. as well. Just one more question just now, and then I'll get into the demonstration. How extensive are the remediation options available to a user? Can you give some examples of the types of remediation actions available, please? So I'll summarize that, but I can actually show that in the demonstration. So we can actually isolate a machine. So if we see something suspicious happening on it, we can actually take it completely off the network, apart from comms to our back end. So stop the bleeding in effect. Or we can get much more surgical. We can actually highlight processes that are seen as malicious and stop them remotely. So potentially getting rid of the need to re-image machines when we see something malicious happening. But let's get into that in the demonstration and actually highlight that. Okay, so back to the environment here. Now, if I pivot to the Cybereason UI, so this is the web UI that we have sat in front of the centralized graph database. So this is where the analyst, where the SOC would work. Now, if I do a refresh on this environment here, this is where we can see the activity that happened during the live attack that I showed. And we can see the timeline here. So we were picking this up live, so mallops by time. This discovery board is loosely aligned to the Lockheed Martin kill chain. So from the left to right, as you go through the steps, the attack is more advanced. So for example, we have example of the initial infection, privileged escalation, lateral movement, etc., and then the detonation of ransomware. Each one of these blue dots represents a malop or a malicious operation. So generally in an organization, I would see this maybe being on the SOC dashboard, giving context to the analysts, to the CISO, etc., whoever it may be. Where is the risk within the business across my environment? Okay, but really where the analyst lives would be in the malop inbox here. So we can notify the analyst via email, via ticketing system, etc., or via integration with an existing SIM tool, like of QRadar, Splunk, if that's what they use to investigate. And this is really where we can show the idea of Cybereason being an analyst in a box, because we're summarizing what we've seen behaviorally on the endpoints to the analyst. So giving much more context than, say, a SIM would do. If the analyst saw a SIM alert, there would still be a lot of legwork that the analyst needs to do before they can make an informed decision whether it's malicious or not. As as I said before, they might need to look on the DNS logs, look on the firewall, look on the endpoint itself to maybe get some of the logs from there. So let's dive into one of these examples here. So phishing is a good example as the first stage. In one screen, we're summarizing a lot of the information from maybe an L1 analyst in this case to make a pretty informed decision. So straight away I can see, we've summarized this as being phishing. a description, the machine and the user involved. Okay, so we can get an idea of, is this an important, is this somebody that has potential access to important information, but also importantly, what we think the root cause is. So initially it was Excel, in this case, spawning PowerShell. So we can see the infection information in the middle here. So straight away we can see it's PowerShell based. And additionally, any inbound or outbound connections associated with that. And it's derived back to the process itself. That's really, really hard to do if you're trying to do that manually as an analyst. Deriving a network connection back to a process, that can take a lot of time. We're doing that out of the box. Also below, the idea of the timeline. So because we're collecting as an organization, as a tool, we're collecting the telemetry data constantly from the endpoint. It's a persistent session from the sensor to the detection server or the graph database. We can flag exactly when this went from normal to being malicious. Importantly as well, if this was across multiple machines, we would show this in a single alert. So for instance, if there was 25 detonations of ransomware across 25 machines, we'd see this in a single malop from a analyst efficiency point of view. And you would see that in the timeline as well, the 25 different endpoints detonating ransomware, but then you'd be able to go straight back to which machine is patient 0 and see, click further in here at any point to see a summarization of that. Also, we have within this initial view, you can export this to PDF, for example. So if you want to show that to executive type users, the CISO, etc., to say, look, we've found this and this is how we've remediated, etc., we can show that there. So think of this as the initial L1 view, but maybe the L2 wants to dive a bit deeper. So at any point we're collecting, you can pivot deeper to get some more context, etc. So from a process point of view, action point of view, so which port was used, which IP or domain were we connected to, how much data was actually communicated between during that session, or information around the machine or multiple machines involved, and then finally the user themselves. Okay, but for this example, I'm going to dive a bit deeper into the process itself. So this was an example into the evidence. So why have we flagged this up as being a malicious operation? So a few things, as we saw in the live attack. So we saw that shell with an unexpected parent. So the user opened from Outlook, opened up an Excel attachment, which is fine, non-malicious. But then Excel spawned a PowerShell session, which is kind of suspect. But we didn't trigger an alert on that alone. That's just one piece of evidence for us. Other things. So the actual PowerShell process itself was using obfuscation of that command. So again, why would an admin using PowerShell quite validly for, say, an identity and access management task for joining with a lever, for example, why would they need to obfuscate that command or compress it in some way? Another example. So that's another indicator for us. And then a couple of the other steps that I showed in the demonstration. So the hacker actually hid behind Firefox. So we did actually some process injection. So we've picked up on that as well. So, we're showing the analyst here why we've decided upon this. But at any point, the analyst can go a bit deeper and actually look into the PowerShell command itself to make sure, yeah, this is malicious. So there's things like invoke expression here, which are, they're potentially malicious. And then the actual obfuscation of the code as well. Looks kind of strange. So at any point here, it's pretty obvious to the analyst, okay, I need to stop the bleeding here. And the way we can do that is if I pivot back, I minimize my window here, give me access. There's a couple of ways we can do that. So as I mentioned during the question session, we can isolate the machine. So we can take that machine completely off the network in this case. And then if this was a malware with multiple machines, we'd be able to take multiple machines off the network quickly in a single click. Okay, but then also we can do a response here. Actually, let me use another example where it's live. Actually, look at particular processes and actually stop them. So let's look. Command and control should still be valid, I think. So this is where we can look at particular processes and kill them. So the processes that we see as malicious, we can remotely stop them. We can also get rid of maybe registry entries that show persistence, for example, or stop executables from running that we flagged as being malicious, for example. Okay, so from an analyst point of view, that's taken a couple of minutes to make an informed decision. That's really trimmed down the process of getting the context of what is actually happening to the actual remediation stage. So it's really putting the analyst back in control, giving that visibility of that gap between the initial infection and the damage stage. So if we pivot back here from forward point of view, we're giving that visibility across this scope here of, like the slide said, 99 days. We're giving the analyst more control again to make those informed decisions. Okay, so I just want to show one more thing before we get in. I'll check to see if there's any more questions. Another thing that Cybereason gives the analyst, particularly kind of L2, L3 analysts, or if an organization is mature enough to have a threat hunting team, we can actually, via the graph, give a graphical way of hunting across the data that we've collected to look for malicious things. So maybe something that hasn't quite popped to be a malware yet, but maybe something that's a suspicion, or something that's at the evidence stage. So these are the kind of things that within a SOC they might need to schedule queries against SIMs, etc. And it's almost like looking for a needle in a haystack. But the power of the graph gives you the ability to do that graphically. So I'm going to use an example which is more kind of IT hygiene than IT security, really. I'm going to look for, okay, who's using, say, peer-to-peer in my environment, or who's using Tor in my environment, just to give you an idea of the kind of information that we can find. So I want to see who's using Tor, but then also which machines are connecting or using Tor tunneling, and which processes are initiating those kind of connections. So each one of these blue icons represents a node, or a node of collected data that we've collected from the entire environment. And each node has connections or relationships with other data nodes. So in this case, I'm going to go from machine to process, then outbound connections, and then ultimately remote address. And then based upon the threat feeds that we have, I'm going to look for anything that's flagged as being Tor based. So straight away here, I can see a few IPs that have been connected to, also the geolocation of those. Now, if I pivot back at each step, I can get a bit more context. So in this case, you can see the actual the IP information, what kind of information, the bits and bytes that have been connected. So received bytes, transmitted bytes, etc. Then pivot back, I can see the processes that have initiated that connection, and then ultimately which machines. So it's important to note here that, for example, here we're in one dashboard, we're showing Windows machines, we're showing Linux machines, and Mac OS X machines in one place. So if I expand this out, I should be able to see that. Slide across. So yeah, so we're capturing from Windows 7, El Capitan, Windows 10, Linux as well. So we go all the way back to their sensor can work on XP Service Pack 3, 2003 server, about 5 versions back on OS X, and then various flavors of Linux and Unix, and we're always adding in new endpoint sensors. So let me just pivot back to the presentation for the last section, and then we can look at some questions. Okay, today we've primarily focused on the endpoint detection and response part of the toolset. So on the right-hand side, that's been a real bread and butter since inception. But we've started to add in functionality to the lightweight sensor as we've seen new hacking techniques, etc. So we're starting to get a bit more proactive. So we can work with existing antivirus, signature-based antivirus out there that clients may have, but we've also added our own signature-based antivirus to, in effect, get rid of a lot of the noise in a single stack. On top of that, we've added in next-generation antivirus functionality based upon machine learning. So you think of this as lines of defense. Antivirus, signature-based antivirus being the first. Next-generation antivirus is checking upon execution whether a file is malicious or not. Then we have the anti-ransomware functionality, which we have the ability to detect and block. And then finally, things like fileless malware protection. So we actually have the capabilities now to look into the PowerShell, as a first stage, look into PowerShell commands and sit between the command line and the DLL that runs the commands and actually pass what is malicious and what isn't, in effect, okay? It's also worth bearing in mind, I didn't show it in the demonstration and we're kind of running slow on time. From a ransomware point of view in the demonstration, we actually stopped that process from running, so the damage stage from happening. So it's just, let me just show you that very quickly in the, I just wanted to reiterate that. So if I step back here, if I go into the ransomware stage here, just a step I forgot to do in the demonstration. If we notice here, the ransomware was actually stopped from detonating. So this is an example of, within the sensor, we're starting to show some proactive tools. So we're able to detect the damage stage, so the mass encryption of data, and then we stop that process from running. So no files were encrypted. Obviously, I chose not to do the PowerShell prevention as part of the demonstration because it would be a very, very short demo, because we would actually been able to block the email attachment from running on the endpoint. So think of this as kind of lines of defense. So we have the signature-based antivirus, then the next generation antivirus, then things like PowerShell blocking, and things like anti-ransomware, with the EDR tool being the real bedrock of that. That's your last line of defense, where you're getting that visibility of everything that's happening on the endpoint to make that informed decision. And that's where you get the idea of the malloc dashboard. Very quickly, let's look to see if there's any additional questions here. Is this easy deployable for small businesses who are mostly cloud-based? Yes, absolutely. So we do have an on-premise solution, but 95% of our customers go for a cloud-based solution. So where the detection server and the web UI that you're seeing here is hosted in the cloud, and then it's a case of installing the lightweight sensor on the endpoint. So it's, for Windows, it's MSI based, or we have installs for different operating systems. And it's very, very easy to roll out and then have it communicating to the back end. So you get value very, very quickly and straight away. Okay, let me just check some other questions here. Does Cybereason support MSSP functionality? Yes, absolutely. So again, as part of being a cloud-based solution, absolutely, that's one of the ways that we can approach smaller companies and adding that value, giving that visibility. Are you able to disconnect the machine and continue to work on it? Do you also lose connection? So the end user, if we do the isolation, the end user would lose their connectivity, but the analyst would still be able to investigate further. The analyst approach really is to stop the bleeding as soon as possible, get the hacker control off that machine completely. So unfortunately, the end user is almost like secondary in that. You want to be, let's get the hacker off, completely stop the bleeding. Does Mallops include a ticketing system? So yes, we have integrations with the likes of Remedy, ServiceNow, etc., and out of the box, but we can do others via API as well. On which devices do you install your software? Only workstations. So yes, so it's across servers, workstations, laptops, etc. Okay, so this is by their nature, they shouldn't be taken on offline unless it's a very, very good reason. So we can actually install the sensor. If it's MSI based, we can do a silent install, so there's no reboot required, etc. We're using less than 5% CPU. It's like 10 mega traffic per day back to the back end. So we want to be as light touch as possible. So roll out across workstations, across laptops, servers as well. Okay. I think that's the last question. Is Splunk integration available? Yes, absolutely. So we actually have an app for Splunk integration, so that if a customer already uses Splunk as their dashboard for notification, etc., then we can integrate with that, and we will show the malop notification directly within the Splunk dashboard. Okay. I think that's the last of the questions. So thank you for your time, and look forward to engaging with you further if you thought today's session was interesting. Thanks again for your time. Bye-bye.